Hello again, family and friends. Another week has passed and it's time for another story. And today's story is a story that occurred in 1992. So we're making progress here, but it's a wonderful story because in the 1980s, I shared with you how we lived in the Philippines, worked in China, moved to Singapore, came home from Singapore to Canada. And once in Canada again, in 1986, we began doing trips almost every year after 1988 to Cuba and to the Soviet Union. And in 1992, a special event occurred which called for a special trip on which my bride Diane even joined me. Diane's family were Ukrainian on both sides. Her grandparents on both sides of her family emigrated to Canada from Western Ukraine, that area that the border moved at different times of history, and one time it would be part of Poland, and the next time it was part of the Ukraine. And they moved to Canada, and both families settled in Manitoba. Diane's mom and dad met in Winnipeg, and were married there, but then moved to Ontario, where she grew up. But the Ukrainian tradition and foods and many, many things were always top priorities in this family to celebrate. August 24th, 1991, the country of origin for Diane's family, the Ukraine, declared independence from the Soviet Union. It was an amazing time. After decades of occupation by the Russians, this was going to be something incredible. And they declared independence, so August 24 of 1992 was the first year anniversary of independence. And that's the event I wanted to take Diane to see. So in 1992, we planned a ministry trip to, of course, the former Soviet Union, because our itinerary for a group of 25 people who joined together, I don't have a picture that I could find anymore of the whole group, but these are a few of the people, including Diane, who joined me on a trip to Moscow, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, Rivne, or Rovno as the Russians pronounced it, and Odessa. And so I want to just quickly tell you some of the exciting things that happened on this trip. It was a real Ukrainian trip because we had 3 people who could speak Ukrainian now living in the U.S. One of them was Luba Dubrenko, who back in December, the end of December, I shared her story of meeting her on my first trip there in 1988, and her twin sister and brother-in-law. And she was now a graduate of Moody Bible Institute and came with us as our interpreter and, of course, our soloist. She's a fantastic vocalist. And she and another brother from the Chicago area named Walter, who was Ukrainian, came, and a man from Washington State named Jim, nice American name, who could speak some Ukrainian as well. So it gave us people on the tour who could certainly translate for us and help us in ministry. So we arrived in Moscow. We did the classic Moscow tour and then flew down to Kiev to arrive on the Sunday before the celebrations of the first anniversary of independence. Monday was that day. That day was just wild. It's the best word I can explain. I have never seen dancing in the streets like there was in the Ukraine, in the capital of the Ukraine, which is where we were on the day of the anniversary. In all my life, the downtown square used to be called Lenin Square, and they had a huge statue of Lenin. That had all, of course, been torn down, and now it was called Independence Square. That square, all day long on August 24th, 1992, was just packed with people, jam-packed. But so the people couldn't move left or right or front or back. So the only way they could move was this way. And as we stood watching down over the square from different locations during the day, all you could see were people's heads bobbing up and down as people danced. There was just music playing all the time. And there was dancing in the streets that I will just never forget. People were so excited and so hopeful that after so many years of communist control, maybe things could change in the Ukraine. It's not been a great history, recent history for them, but they at least have their independence. Well, we went, of course, as a ministry trip, which is what we did on all of the trips that I would like to share with you about and just share some of the elements of in the days ahead. But we took bags of Bibles, children's Bibles, music cassettes in Russian, because, as you know, Russian was the language pretty much used daily and day-to-day events in the Ukraine, even though the Ukrainians have their own language. Russian was the dominant language of the entire area for decades. And there was worship music, beautiful praise music of those praise tapes that were around in the 90s in the Russian language. And we would go into a restaurant as a group to have dinner, and we would ask them, can you put this cassette on in the background of music? And they loved it, and we would leave it with them, and they said, oh, we'll play it all the time. So we had just incredible opportunities, and of course, a lot of children's material as well. We went to church, of course, every Sunday whenever there was a service. Luba Dubrenko would sing for us, and she would interpret when they asked us to bring greetings or occasionally when they asked me to speak. And it was just a very, very special time. We also visited 3 children's hospitals. One was actually in Chernobyl area. In 1986, when we were coming home to Canada from Singapore, we had originally planned to go to the Ukraine, but that was the year of the Chernobyl explosion. And we decided not to put the kids in any possible contact with challenges there. And so we eliminated that part of our trip that year. And now we had a chance to go back 6 years later to Chernobyl. Well, what was most notable there were hospitals for children who had some different types of cancer that came from this nuclear explosion that occurred, or the meltdown that occurred in Chernobyl in 1986. And the effects were still being felt. And there were children's hospitals all over the place with kids that were having difficulties medically and physically. And so we spent time ministering to them. In fact, the in-tourist guides, who we still had to have even as late as 1992, were blown away that these Canadians and Americans, we had representatives in our group from all across North America, even from Hawaii. And they were blown away that we would spend our time on vacation ministering to children. They just didn't understand how we understand the benefit and the blessing of blessing kids. And so we had candy, we had children's Bibles. I'll be showing you some pictures as I speak about these different things. And we had something that was really special. One lady in the group had made these little bracelets with colored little beads on the bracelet that were the same as the wordless book. Remember, if you remember years ago as a Christian, we had something called a wordless book. We would sing with a book that had nothing but a full color on the page, and we'd turn the pages. You know, it started with black. My heart was black with sin until the Savior came in. The next page was red. His precious blood I know. And then the next page was white, has washed it white as snow. And in God's word I'm told, I'll walk on streets of gold. And so the next page was gold. And then green was on the cover for the symbol of spiritual growth in your life in Jesus. Well, that was called the wordless book. Well, these bracelets had exactly those colors in a bead that was on the bracelet. And we had hundreds of those bracelets. And so we gave one to every kid in these places that we visited. And many times their parents, if they were there visiting with them, or the workers in the hospital, they said, we want one too. Because Luba would explain in their language to them what those colors meant. And it was essentially a brief explanation of the gospel and what Jesus has accomplished through his death and resurrection. And so it was just a great time with these kids. And we would have a little program every time we went to one of these 3 hospitals to bless the kids. We also met in believers' homes. In Moscow, for example, one time we were there without Luba and Walter and Jim, and we had nobody to translate, and these people only spoke Russian, and our group only spoke English. However, we had one of the most wonderful fellowship times that I can remember. Musically, this was a very musical family. So one of the kids got out his violin and he started playing, and someone else had a guitar, and they began singing for us, and we sang for them. And then ultimately, we all knew the song Amazing Grace. And so together, they in Russian, we in English, we sang with them Amazing Grace. Some of the other homes we visited were, of course, Luba's family. Luba's twin sister was married to Pavel Linyevich, and he had 2 daughters from a first marriage. His wife was killed in an auto accident. And we visited, of course, with her family several times, and even met her dad. Her dad was a Baptist pastor who in his younger years had spent time in prison because of the Soviet system. And he was now 92 years of age when we took this picture and when we had a special time of fellowship with him and to encourage him in his elderly years. The ministry included travel to Rivne, or Rovno, as the Russians pronounce the same city's name, in western Ukraine. We went there because there were 3 ministries that we wanted to encourage and to learn from. One of them was named New Life Ministry, another one was Light of the Gospel, and the other one was called Good Samaritan. So we went to all 3 ministry centers, and we especially wanted to go to the Light of the Gospel group because Open Doors had done 1 million children's Bibles in those early years of the 90s. You've seen pictures, I'm sure, by now on my cutaways here. But those children's Bibles were amazing. A picture on every double page and the story on the right-hand side. They were just loved by everyone. Even sometimes kids complained they couldn't get to read them because their parents wanted to do it first. And that group, Light of the Gospel in Rivne, had distributed 100,000 copies. 1/10 of the whole project was done through their ministry. And so we wanted to go. And so while we're there, they said, hey, you guys, you got to come into the back room and see what we have here. And they had several printing presses that had been smuggled into them back in the Cold War years by Open Doors people. And how they did it is they took one part at a time. Travelers would come into the area with one piece of a printing press in their suitcase, just a single piece. And they did that long enough until they had every part needed to put this together. Then an Open Doors worker would come into the country and he would put this together. Then, of course, they needed important things like ink and paper, and all of those things had to be provided as well if they were going to do anything of any significance. But those secret printing presses were all over the former Soviet Union. And here in Rivne, just by God's coincidence, we see 2 of them, I think there were, that were still operating and that had been smuggled in many, many years earlier. It was quite a significant time. Ministry trips are exciting, always exciting in serving the Lord and in meeting people and how God works out details for you when you don't know where you're going or what you're going to do. And each day becomes an exciting adventure. But there's also spiritual warfare. It doesn't always happen easily. And Diane always jokes with me that when she's with me, the spiritual warfare is even harder. Because on this trip, we had our challenges. We had a lady with us from Hawaii named Lorraine. Lorraine got a phone call while we were in Kiev that her son had fallen off a balcony from a very high level apartment building, and he was in very serious condition. She was able to fly home. She left our group to fly home, and she made it home just hours before her son passed away. But she was able to be with him in his last hours of life. Also, we had a pastor with us from Ontario named Pastor Bill. And Pastor Bill was in the picture I showed you with Diane and myself an earlier part of this video. And he had potential, he told us, of angina problems, but his doctor gave him clearance to come on the trip. When we got to Rivne and we were in one of those ministry centers, it was a hot day. And I show you a picture now of Bill. And we should have realized what was going on. On that day, it was so hot and stuffy in that room that he began to feel faint. And in fact, he actually ultimately passed out. So we had to call an ambulance, and we had him rushed to the hospital, and they gave him shots of nitroglycerin to help him and put him in the ICU, in the intensive care unit. Well, that afternoon, one of the gals who spoke some Russian came with me, and we went to see Bill at the hospital. And we got there, and the doctor said, "Oh, you must wear special gowns into the intensive care unit. You can't just walk in with your street clothes." Okay. So he instructs the nurse to go get some gowns for us from the closet. She opens the closet, and there aren't any left. And he says, "Herschel, okay, let's just go." So we walk in our street clothes into the intensive care unit, and I see why it didn't matter. Bill is lying on a cot, and when he saw us, he broke into a big smile, and he says, "I'm feeling a lot better, but I have only one request. Get me out of here." He says, "I've been lying on this cot looking up at the fluorescent lights," and he says, "Take a look at what I've been seeing." And I looked up at those fluorescent lights, and there were 1,000,000 flies, half of them dead, half of them still flying around. He says, "I could feel them landing on my arms while I was lying here." This was an intensive care unit. And he just said, "Get me out of here." So we told the doctor, "Well, we'll be responsible. We will take care of him." Well, we did, but boy, we had to just be so careful with Bill right to the end. In fact, when we finally got him home, Diane sighed the biggest sigh of relief I've ever heard her give when Bill finally got safely home. But it was a challenge. In Odessa, our last location, we went to the beach to hand out tracts that were written in Ukrainian, and there were thousands of people on the beach. People of the former Soviet Union always loved the beach, just like Canadians. And when there was time to be there, everybody possible went there. And so we went to the beach with hundreds and hundreds of tracts. They share the gospel message in them. And it was so interesting because here, in our country, if we did this, most people say, "I don't want your garbage, keep it." But there, people were so interested. And of course, there's a bunch of foreigners coming around, all fully dressed, standing on a beach, and with a handful of these papers. And people would actually come up. We didn't even have to go hand them out. People would come up and ask us for them. And we just say, "Sure, here you go. And we would just hand them out, holus bolus, and we handed out every one of them. We met with a Messianic Jewish group. That was our last Sunday, was in Odessa. And they had an afternoon service, and we went to their service. And then they said, "We'd like to come to supper with you." We had it all planned at a hotel, and we said, "Sure, come join us." So they came and joined us. And they told me a story then that I want to tell you as I conclude this video. It's a story I have never forgotten, and which I tell often, and I think is absolutely hilarious. And the story is a serious story in its origin, because in the past, the Orthodox, the Slavic people were not very accommodating for the Jewish community. You just look at Fiddler on the Roof, and you'll understand some of the challenges. And they were often having what they called pogroms to drive the Jewish people out of their communities. Well, this Jewish man, an elderly Jewish man, told us a story. He said, I have to tell you one story about that time of a period of our Jewish history here in the country. There was a town where this was going on, and the Jewish people said, we're fed up with this. We're just going to call it what it is. So they went to the leadership of the town and they said, we want to have a debate with you. And if we win the debate, we will stay and you will not harass us. If we lose the debate, we will voluntarily leave and never bother you again. Well, they agreed to do this debate. The Orthodox people, or the Slavic people, I should say, chose their Orthodox priest to be their representative in the debate. And the Jewish people, of course, chose their rabbi to be their spokesperson in the debate. And they then decided to make the debate even more complicated and challenging. They said, no words, only symbols. And they agreed, they drew straws, and the Orthodox priest got to go first. He stood up and he said this. It was the rabbi's turn now, and he looked a little puzzled, but he came up and he went like this. Now the priest's turn again, and on his second round, the priest stood up and he held up 3 fingers. And the rabbi came for his turn, and he wasn't quite sure what to do, but he held up 1 finger. Then the priest went to a cabinet at the side of the room, and he brought out a plate, and on the plate he had a glass of wine and a little bread bun on it. Bread and wine. And he held out the plate. Now it was the rabbi's turn, and he looked really puzzled. And he walked up on the stage, he put his hand in his pocket, and he pulled out an apple and held out the apple. The Orthodox priest says, you win, you win, you win. You Jewish people are just too smart. I can't go anywhere. You won. And he walks off the stage to one side while the rabbi walks off on the other side. And as the priest walks off, his people say, Father, how did you lose? He said, well, I said to him, God is everywhere. And he said to me, but God is also right here. I said to him, God is 3 persons in one being. And he said to me, but God is also one. And then I showed him the elements of the Eucharist, the blood and bread that symbolizes the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus. And he showed me an apple which says, but all men are sinners. And I couldn't go anywhere from there. He won, he won. Now the rabbi's going off the other side. The Jewish people are saying, Rabbi, how did you win? He says, I don't know. He told me, you Jewish people can live anywhere else in the world you want to live. And I told him, we're going to live right here. He said, he told me, you Jewish people have 3 days to get out of town. And I told him, we aren't going anywhere. And they said, but Rabbi, what was that plate with the bread and the wine on it? And the rabbi says, that's what I really don't know. He showed me his lunch. I showed him my lunch. Meanings are in people. And that's what I learned from that story, and I have learned ever since.